So welcome everybody. This is the May e-learning network recording and webinar, sorry, I just set it to record. I'm very pleased to welcome Ben Betts to do today's session. Ben is from HT2 Labs. Ben, you want to say some more about yourself?
Yes, of course. So thank you for joining us, everyone who's joined us live, and to those of you watching the recording, welcome too. Joan says my company is called HT2 Labs. I've been with HT2 for about 14 or 15 years, and we are a software as a service product company working in the learning technology space. We have a few products that you might have heard of, including Curator and Learning Locker. I myself was a member of the e-learning network board of directors for a couple of years. I know it's not quite election time yet. I didn't realise that those directors still have some time on the clock, but I must say, if you did a chart of the rise of my personal performance and my company trajectory, you'd do well to trace it back beyond 2010 when I became a director of the eLN for the first time. So it's a very great privilege to speak with you today.
Excellent. Well, look, if you'd like to set your slides up, and I'll just mention to people a couple of other things. First of all, I'm going to launch the membership poll. And also, I want to remind people that there is a chat function. And if you are using the chat function, then please make sure you write to all panelists and attendees, and then everybody can see your comments. And then the other thing to say is that there is a Q&A function. If you want to ask a private question, you can log one in there. And I think that's probably it, really. So over to you, Ben. I'll mute myself and stop the video now. Sorry, Ben, I wasn't hearing you there.
Can you hear me now, Joan?
Yes, sorry. For some reason, you went to mute. That might have been.
Okay, that's all right. Start again. Hi, everybody. So I'm Ben, as I introduced earlier at the top of the show, for those of you just joining. I'm here today to talk to you about being more proactive about performance. And I'm going to dig in a bit and build on a webinar that was previously recorded around the XAPI last month with the eLN, to talk a little bit about using that for learning analytics and driving workplace and learning success. I'm going to do a little bit of preamble about where we come from and the problems that we're trying to solve. And then I'm going to sort of step you through 3 stages of becoming proactive about performance using data fundamentally. And along the way, I'll mention a couple of case studies. I'm going to stop off particularly at a case study with a company called Villeroy and Boch, who have won awards at the Learning Technologies Awards for the last few years running. Actually, this year they picked up a bronze in the Best Blended category, and that's the particular project that I'm going to show you today. So the thing that I really want to start off with today is thinking about how folks are using data at the moment. And this is a quote that I bring up from time to time to say that still, this is 2015 in a McKinsey survey, so a little out of date, but back in 2015, McKinsey thought that only 13% of companies were tracking programs' return on investment beyond participant feedback. And I think that's a sort of familiar stat that we've seen in a bunch of areas. It hasn't really shifted very much. Here's a slightly more up-to-date version of this. This is from the Chief Learning Officer Business Intelligence Board last summer. So this is 12 months old or something like that. So 1,500 chief learning officers or those sorts were sort of surveyed here to think about how they were thinking about learning impact and how they were measuring it. And for me, becoming proactive about performance means that we have to understand what's actually having an impact in the first place so that we can do more of what works and we can do less of what doesn't. And I think these sorts of surveys are kind of telling in terms of what folks are doing. Again, some similar sorts of stats or trends, at least, to the McKinsey routine. 69% already saying that they measure employees' feedback, their response to training. If you look down towards the bottom right, you have ROI, return on investment. Still the holy grail of learning and development and training. Can we see that anything really mattered? And if you add up the various bars here, so the top one is 26% saying they already do it, 23% saying they're going to do it in the next 12 months, 14% saying in the next 24, 15% saying they're going to, but they're not sure when, and then 22% saying that they have no plans. If you tot up the 23, the 14, the 15, in terms of the number of chief learning officers that say they plan to do more about measuring return on investment over the coming period, there's no other learning impact measure that they're trying to get to more than return on investment or planning to. So I wonder down the line, I haven't got a longitudinal study here to see how this might have changed over time, but I kind of suspect this has been like this for a while. Still the holy grail. Hardly anybody can do it consistently. But more than half of us think that we really should be thinking about measuring return on investment amongst other measures of impact. So I guess this is what I'm kind of focused on at HT2 Labs at the moment. We have a few pieces of software, and the one that sort of centers around this is one called Learning Locker. And with Learning Locker, what we're looking to do is to help the Learning and Development Department become more proactive about how they intervene in business and performance, as opposed to being reactive. And even being reactive would be good on occasions. For some of us, it's difficult to get to the right reporting measures to understand what's actually happened. But it's one thing to be able to judge historically what has occurred. It's quite another thing and a different level that we could go to and a different level of service we could offer to our businesses if we were able to be more proactive about it, if we were able to actively change our stance in order to manipulate the future outcome of something. If we could see that a particular initiative or a particular KPI was going out of measure and that we could do something, we could make an intervention to change that ahead of it occurring, then learning and development would really change its role as, instead of being a bit of a cost center, we'd end up being more of a value center. So I'm interested in helping L&D become more proactive about it. We use a tool called Learning Locker to help folks do this. This was developed here at HT2 Labs. It's what we call an open source learning record store. So it's available for free. You can download it, install it, and use it both for yourself and for your organization. There is an enterprise version, but fundamentally the best core tool that you would need to do some of the stuff I'm going to talk to you about today is free and open source. It's Learning Locker. Now, I won't dwell hugely on the mechanics of it, but just a bit of background in terms of what Learning Locker is and what it is not, to help folks who might not be familiar with the concept of a learning record store, and specifically the Experience API. The e-learning network has run another good session on what XAPI is, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but just my personal way of thinking about the Experience API is demonstrated with a bit of a story. So the XAPI has become the logbook, the activity stream, the log of what has occurred throughout lots of different learning experiences. It's the way in which we capture in granular detail what people have done along a journey and use that detail potentially to then shape others who come afterwards. Now, my example of a good logbook takes me back to 1943 and an interesting family story. So 1943, my grandfather, my dad's dad, Harry Betts, was a pilot of Halifax bombers in the RAF. He, unlike many others, survived his 30 missions and on active service and was sent over to Canada to help train new recruits. So 1943, he was in Canada piloting folks around. At the same time, although unbeknownst to us all, my wife's grandfather, Desmond Brown, a rookie, was sent out to Canada to train to be a navigator on bombers. And years later, Desmond would become an accountant. He kept meticulous records of everything that he did. And one Christmas, we dug out his logbook, his training logbook of what Desmond had done on his way to becoming a qualified navigator. And sure enough, on the 18th of July, 1943, the last row in this particular picture that you're seeing here, we had evidence that Desmond Brown, my wife's grandfather, was piloted by my dad's father, my grandfather, Sergeant Betts, on a training mission over Canada. It's a pretty unbelievable coincidence. 72 years later, my wife and I would meet, get married. My son, who we briefly chatted about before we started recording, is in the other room at the moment, is named for these guys, Harry Desmond Betts, because it's just such a remarkable story of what a log can tell if you keep it over time. So this is the sort of thing that's been going on for at least 70 years, because here's the evidence. But a modern day version of it is something that we do with the Experience API. So instead of writing down in a book what we did and how it occurred, we do it on the computer. The learning record store is the logbook. So here's a brief screenshot of what a learning record in a learning locker might look like. It has this idea of the actor, the person doing something, the verb of what they did, and the object of what they were doing here. So we have ideas of looking halfway down the page of David Steingesser opening leadership fundamentals, completing a module on leadership fundamentals. And within that, we'd have a lot of metadata about what it is David was doing whilst he was doing this. And it's at this level of granularity that we're able to analyze what it is has been the difference between someone who's been successful and someone who's been unsuccessful, and look to repeat it to shape that behavior going into the future. Today is GDPR Day. If you're watching live, it is May 25th in Europe. Well, it's May 25th everywhere, I'm pretty sure, but it's more significant for those of us in Europe. And at the end of this session, I will talk about GDPR briefly, just to bring us round to what the reality of GDPR and data privacy means in a world of this level of granular data. But skipping over that for a moment, this is what a learning record store looks like. And a learning record store is a potentially new piece of technology for us. To become proactive about performance and use a learning record store probably means getting a piece of kit that you don't have right now. Learning record store is a data warehouse of sorts. It's this log store, and what it will do is will aggregate learning data from many different sources. So not just stuff that people are doing on a learning management system, but stuff they might be doing outside the learning management system. That whole 70-20-10 spread, the learning record store is able to capture data from all of those different elements and present it as one source of record in a unified format. That's incredibly important for the data geeks amongst us, because dealing with data at that sort of scale is difficult if you don't have it in a standard format. And I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. We can also use the LRS to help automate things. A lot of you who work in L&D will be very familiar with a sheer amount of administration that goes on. If this happens, then you've got to enroll somebody onto that. You've got to send them the survey. You've got to send them the follow-up survey. You've got to get the line manager. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. Well, if we've got data about where people are in a particular journey, and we've got it coming from multiple different sources, then we can trigger activities automatically on other systems. So automating activities as a result of data coming into the LRS is increasingly important. And finally, analysis. I'm going to expect to do some level of analysis on the data that's coming in. And that might look like building reports, the sorts of reports that you'd expect out of a normal learning system. Or it might look like taking that data into something like a business intelligence tool and doing some proper statistical analysis on what's occurred so that you can spot patterns and trends in your data and start to move towards that proactivity. A quick word on what an LRS will not do. An LRS will not do a lot of the things that you suspect you might have in a learning management system. So if you've got a learning management system need and you sit there saying, well, do I really need a learning management system, or will an LRS suffice? There are use cases where an LRS will do everything you need and you won't necessarily need to put in a learning management system. But in many cases, especially when you maintain a formal online or classroom training element to your business, you probably are going to need some form of learning management to keep that going. So an LRS will not host content for you. You can't upload SCORM packages to it or any other form of content. It's a database, but it's a database of activity, not of content. You can't do enrollments. You can't necessarily put somebody from this course onto that course or something like that. Whilst you could use the automation features to trigger that sort of thing, the actual enrollment process is probably a function of learning management, not of learning records. Remember, it's a record store. It's what has happened as opposed to what might happen in the future. It won't build your courses. So you can't put an online course together using a learning record store, but you can record the activity that people have done on a website. So you could, for instance, put together a course in WordPress or Drupal, and then use the data back in the learning record store to understand what people have done. So LRS doesn't replace LMS. For many organizations, especially those at scale, it will be another piece of software. For some folks, the LMS might come with an LMS. For some folks, they might not need an LMS, but the situation is really dependent. 3 quick differences before I go into the proactive about performance piece. The differences that I sort of hone in are one, connectivity. An LRS will take data from many different sources. And if we're going to become proactive about performance, it means that I don't just have to have learning data, I also have to have performance data in here. I have to know what people have done on the job, as well as what they've done in training, to understand the relationship between the two. So that's not something you can generally do in a learning management system. A learning management system doesn't generally allow you to track what people are doing in their day-to-day job, be that calls made, or sales leads closed, or any other sort of metric that would become part of a day-to-day operational business. Learning Record Store will also output that data to a lot of different places. It will output it to analytics packages. It will output it to credentialing packages to say that somebody has achieved something. It will actually put it out to other learning record stores as well. So you can actually daisy chain these things together. A little bit more on the analytics. I'd expect the analytics in a learning record store to be superior to those in a learning management system. Typically, a learning management system can only report on things that it knows happened in advance. So you, as the administrator, create a course with a module with a piece of learning in it, and then you can track who's done the learning, who's completed the module, who's completed the course. That's the sort of stuff you'd expect to be able to do in a learning management system. But what if I didn't know what people are going to do? What if I didn't know that they were going to bookmark a video on YouTube, or have a line manager conversation, or get a piece of peer feedback? That's very difficult for a learning management system to report because it's not in a formal workflow. What an LRS allows you to do is to analyze things that fall outside of the formal learning workflow. It can take data from anywhere, and it can analyze data from anywhere. And that's quite special. That's the sort of thing that you'll see in big data packages like Elastic from AWS, more than you'll see in learning management systems of today. Third and final point about a learning record store, that this is quite important. A learning record store is a technical term. A learning record store is a name that is given to a piece of software that conforms to a set of tests that says, yes, you do accept data in the right format, you can call yourself a learning record store. At least you can call yourself a valid learning record store. This is really important from a data standpoint. If we're going to become proactive about performance, a lot of what we're going to do is go through historical data records to understand what happened previously, to start predicting what might happen in the future. And if you find out that the data you collected over the last 12, 18, or 24 months is garbage in some way, shape, or form, in some format, it doesn't work, it's not valid. And we've all done this, where we see odd email addresses or bits of data that needs cleansing in some way, shape, or form. If you have that problem, then you're not going to know about it for 24 months until you come to do some predictive analytics, and it's not going to work. That's an absolute disaster for you, because you've lost years of what you need to do, and you're going to have to go back and cleanse that data, sometimes by hand, which is a tremendously taxing job. So what would be much better is that you maintain a sense of validation on the way in, that you made sure that all the data that came in to your database, to your learning record store, was in the right format in the first place. And then I wouldn't have to bother going back and cleansing it all and changing it all retrospectively. The XAPI is the specification by which we do this. So it's a document that says this is how you can collect learning data in a standard way. And if we all go to that sort of standard, then we should have data that can be interoperable and used both in this learning record store, in the next one, and in packages of things like predictive tools in years to come. So really important, if you're going to choose a learning record store, go visit the adlnet.gov website, adopters.adlnet.gov, and check that the learning record stores that you're looking at are valid, certified as being conformant to the latest specification. Because if they're not, there's a chance you might be collecting garbage. I'm going to take a pause here for a moment, because my next little bit is going to actually sort of build on that scene setting of what XAPI was, what a learning record store is, what it's not, and start to really get to the meat of today, which is becoming proactive about performance. But anybody have any questions, anything I can answer for you whilst I'm in this position? So I'm just going to take a quick pause for a minute and check back on the comments we've got here.
Ben, do you want to just put that URL into chat, the one you mentioned?
You're testing my speed writing, but yes, the ability to type and talk at the same time is not one I have mastered. But adopters.adl.net.gov is a good source. There are, I think last time I looked, there was 8, maybe 10 or something like that. It's quite rigorous to pass these tests. There's something like 1,300 individual tests that have to be passed for the software to be conformant. But it's a really good list of people who have understood the problems you might face going forwards and go from there. As this sort of trend picks up, you will see more and more providers saying, oh, we've got a learning record store. And it's a really good pushback to you go and say, okay, great. Are you conformant? Can I see that you've passed the test? Because otherwise, There's something not quite right there. I mean, anybody's got the right to call themselves a learning record store at the end of the day. I don't think the LRS police are going to come and get you. But it's a good pushback, because it'd be an absolute disaster to have collected data over the course of years and then find out that some of it couldn't be used, or that you couldn't transport it from one provider to another. We've been locked in this world with LMSs for years, because everyone says, oh yeah, it's super easy to export and go from one to the next. But of course it's not, because all of their data structures are completely unique. The LRS, this idea of the LRS is to standardize the data structure about learning activity, and therefore you can drop and place it. So a lot of the large organizations we're working with are saying, well, that's interesting, because now I do need a learning management system, but I'm in a much better position if the data is something that's standard and potentially something that I own in an open source sort of way. Then I'm in control of the destiny, and I can mix and match the learning management system and the other tools as we go from there. Thomas says almost none of the big LMS systems are on that website. It is interesting, isn't it, Thomas? Doesn't stop them saying things, but yeah. We ask questions of folks, and that's a good question to ask.
We've also got 3 questions under Q&A, if you can pull those up. Otherwise, I'll read them out to you.
So I'll start at the top. Wesley, we've been developing XAPI this week and found the number of authoring tools don't develop to ADL standard as spec has massive inconsistencies. They're using the old Tinker wrapper examples forwarded to ADL and they don't reply. Gomo and Rise using Tinker wrapper that is 3 years old. Yeah, this is true. Do I answer live? Ooh, answering live. So you'll find that some of the more widely used author tools, Storyline, for example, has had tin can support for a number of years. What it actually outputs and how it outputs things is dodgy. It's not a very high quality. So we often find that we have to intervene to make a modification to increase the quality. You will find some providers that are much better. So if you look at a Domino, for example, they've got some really good examples of things there. So what you found was major providers rushing towards a new way of doing something, and before it had potentially been thought out, and they've got reasonably long software development life cycles, so things don't change very quickly. So that is a real factor at that point. You'll also find that not everyone in the world is going to be XAPI, and I'll talk in the next bit about what we deal with that, because it's unrealistic to expect other people to match the format we want perfectly. So we can do something about that ourselves. It also plays a little bit, Wesley, to the idea of, is SCORM broken for that sort of purpose and other bits like that? There is a question mark in my mind about if you're getting a level of data out of SCORM, somebody launched and completed, and that's all you want for that purpose. Is there an enormously compelling business case to switch it all out to XAPI? I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced there is. But I do think there's a really compelling business case elsewhere around non-SCORM data. And there is a compelling case to maybe convert that SCORM data into XAPI laterally so that you have a single source of record. But some things ain't broke, perhaps don't need fixing. Other things that are interesting early adopter attempts are not the best. Michael Ditchburn, are there any LMS systems you're aware of that include an LMS as part of the core offering? One of the answers to this question is yes. So, for example, both Saba and Cornerstone On Demand have a learning record store within them, according to their website. I'm actually speaking to Saba next week, so I don't want to preach ahead of time, but I'm not convinced it will be a conformant learning record store, because if Saba had gone to the problems of making a conformant learning record store, then why wouldn't you get the badge? Like, you just press the button. All you've got to do is press a button and it runs the test and does it. If you'd gone to the effort of making it conformant, it seems like a big oversight to have not pressed the button. So maybe they have, in which case wonderful. If not, then they need to stretch themselves a bit further. Cornerstone's implementation doesn't look like a learning record store. You will see some interesting sort of, not saying next tier down, but obviously those are the big boys of things. And actually Skillsoft are doing some interesting work with their Percipio tool, where they'll be going out to external LRSs like Learning Locker. So they've cottoned on. They're doing something right. If you look at the next set down in terms of Moodle or Totara can be made to be XAPI conformant with a plugin called the XAPI log store plugin. If you look at some providers here in the UK like Agilia, and Tesselo. Those have been XAPI from the start. My own software platform, Curator, has been XAPI conformant for a long time. So there are systems, there are lists of adopters of it, and there are things like that. But these guys, especially the bigger ones, are on very long software development life cycles. So a lot of it, you'll get feedback to say, it's on my roadmap, but their roadmap's long and their development life cycle is very long as well. So you have to play fair with them. They are, they're the kind of tanker ships of the world. It takes a lot to turn that around. But I have seen signs from nearly all of them that they're either getting to it or they have done it. I think that's it for the moment. Any more questions, then do lob them in the Q&A. I will take a look back on some of the chat that's come in, just to put it there.
Ben, given the date today, 25th of May, can I flag up maybe something we deal with at the end, unless you've got it in your script, which is about GDPR and collecting all these records?
Yeah, I've got it at the end. I'll say a brief bit about it now, as you've asked, Joan. There's two sides to GDPR as far as I'm concerned with this data. One is the right to have collected any data in the first place, and the second is the rights of individuals to know that data has been collected, to access it, to modify it, and so on and so forth. So as an organization, you have these obligations regardless of anything like that. You shouldn't be collecting data that you don't have a purpose for. So just collecting data in the XAPI format mindlessly, thinking that one day it might be useless, is not a good data strategy anyway. So regardless of GDPR, there were already data protection laws and advisories that say you shouldn't really do that. GDPR now really reinforces that, to say you need to have a distinct purpose. And sometimes that's going to come in a legal contractual form, or you're going to play it out as a legitimate interest. For most folks, if you go to the performance sort of side of things, the business maybe has a contract that ticks off some things there. Legitimate interest in education and training is a very strong idea, that an education or training provider has a legitimate interest in enabling an individual who signed up, or their company has signed up on their behalf, to succeed in a training or development thing, be successful. I believe there is a legitimate interest in us doing that. So if we want to be proactive about increasing performance there, and we have a clear path to do it, then I believe, given that you notify people what it is you're going to do and ways around submitting various disclosures if they don't need to, then I think you're okay for the most part. The other thing is that if you have a learning record store, a single source of data, you're in a very good position as far as administration of GDPR becomes concerned. Because right now, any one of us who's an LMS administrator today could be pinged with a little data access request and would have to go looking. But if you've got data in many systems, in many places, that becomes an enormous admin headache. If we've collected data in a single format, in one that's readable by both machines and by humans, like the XAPI, and we've deployed a learning record store, it's so much easier for me to fulfill the individual rights of what someone should get there. And actually to turn that on its head and say, actually, shouldn't we give everyone access to this in the first place? What would the individual do with it if they knew what their transcript was of what they could plug into it? So I actually think it's a tremendous opportunity as far as we're concerned here. The law is the law, and it needs to be conformed to. But the opportunities here should outweigh the fear-mongering as far as I'm concerned. So, Fiona, a quick comment, SCORM is not robust enough, e.g. loss completions. My view is everyone should be adopting. Yeah, I mean, XAPI would suffer the same problem. If you don't have something that captures everything, then if you have some break between the system that generated the statement and something that collected it, then XAPI is going to suffer in the same way that SCORM does. XAPI has more robustness around it because I can store things locally, wait until I know they've been received by the LRS, and then tick them off. So, for example, if you have a mobile app where you're doing a piece of learning or whatever you're doing there, and that mobile app is XAPI enabled, then what you can do is get it to send an XAPI statement. And if there's no internet connectivity, or if it doesn't get a, yep, I received it response from the LRS, then the app can keep on hold of that until such time as it does send and it can go. And the learning record store can take account for that in terms of the time that it happened and other things that went on. So XAPI does introduce a level of robustness there that isn't present in previous standards. You're quite right, Fiona. But there are still obstacles to overcome. You've still got to program that app in the first place to be smart enough to hold on to its data until such time as it knows it can let go of it. So XAPI as a spec doc makes allowances for how that would occur. Not everyone's implementing it in that way. So Wesley asked an earlier question about how some author tools are doing some things in a very old hat way. It seems unlikely that they're going to help with that problem because they're not doing that in the right way. So I think XAPI as a document, as a way of working, offers us an opportunity. Whether we choose to take that opportunity or not is quite something else. So guys, I'm going to keep going on the QA. I'm going to lob into my presentation once more after I take a small swig. Because you came here to hear me talk about becoming more proactive, about doing things in the future. And I have an unbelievably simplistic way of thinking about this, which is thinking about just 3 little steps that we can take. I say 3 little steps. They're obviously enormous steps. The first thing that folks need to do is to connect systems together, because we just don't have data in the right format, of the right quality, or in a single source for us to be able to do any sort of analysis in a holistic way, something that takes in all of the aspects of training, or many of the aspects of training, and aspects of performance. We just don't have the data in the right format or in a single spot. So the first thing we need to do is get it into one spot. The second thing we need to do is to analyze and understand what it is that data is saying. Learning analytics is a fancy buzzword phrase in ed tech right now, and undoubtedly that's seeping in towards learning technologies, although it's being referenced more as impact than learning analytics. I think learning analytics and impact and proactive about performance and whatever good buzzwords you want to wrap it up in are fundamentally saying the same thing. Someone's going to have to do some statistics. Somewhere around here, we're going to need a stats geek. And a lot of the time, statistics turns out to not find any relationship between any variables whatsoever. So there's an awful lot of failures for those successors where you say, hey, it looks like this might have an influence over this. There could be a relationship here. And you'll get echoes of lots of things about correlation, not necessarily meaning causation and things like that. But the actual opportunities where you'll see patterns that are repeatable, predictable, will actually be few and far between. You need to actually have a bit of time in this to see those go through. And then the final step, predictive modeling, is based on finding those repeating patterns, that if people do this, then this tends to occur. And some of those are positive things. If people take this training course, then they become more effective salespeople. Some of those are negative things. If people don't turn up, then they tend to leave the company. Either way is fine. We can build predictive models. We can build ideas both ways. And we can do things quite simplistically. It doesn't have to be at that very high level. We can add value all the way from, do they complete the course? Will they be good at their job? To, do they read the email? Should I send them an email at a different time of day? All of these things and every element of granularity between them could be the subject of a predictive model. But to get to that promised land, to get to that bit where your stakeholders say, I just want you to make it like Amazon recommends, just do that. You're like, that's wonderful. I shall see you in a few years' time, and I'm going to need a lot of data. Amazon can do that because of its position. It has enormous amounts of data, and it has had quite a lot of time to understand that data. And even then, their algorithms aren't great, because every Christmas I come around and buy something for the wife or something for my son, and then I'm getting recommended all sorts of Peppa Pig-based content for myself throughout the rest of the year. So there's lots of nuances to actually what's being done there. Toby, who's asking a few questions in the chat, is working with a company, Filtered, who have spent a lot of time doing this. I'm sure there'll be a webinar from them on the eLN YouTube already about talking about the difficulties of what it is to actually do some of this. So if you want to get to that promised land of being proactive, you've got to start simple. And starting simple is really starting with a single source of data, getting stuff in one place. Because right now, most of the companies that we go and talk to, they've got all sorts of stuff all over the place. And even small companies have got this. They've got lots of little platforms, or even some big ones, and they've got lots of repetition about it. And if you're global, it gets worse. If you've acquired another company, it's 10 times as bad. And all of these things are sometimes connected, sometimes not. Some are inside the single sign-on, some are not. Sometimes we've got data from this place, but that place I can't get a spreadsheet out of. I can't do this, I can't do that. So you've got to think of how we can get it into that funnel, put it into the sort of data warehouse. So imagine my pipes sort of methodology here in terms of the first thing you've got to do is bring consistency. So what I want to do is I want to get data from my key sources. I don't necessarily need to do it for everything, because there may be some sources of data that you look at and say, we don't get a lot of data from this, and the data that we get, we don't believe will be particularly relevant or would be incredibly time consuming and expensive to get. So sometimes you have to leave some data behind and say, we're just not going to get it. But other times when you've got important data sources about what people are doing in the formal and the social and the informal sectors of learning and performance, then you need to find a way to get that data, whether or not it's XAPI already or not. So there are things in the world that will output XAPI data in a good format that will go to a learning record store. And that's very simple. At that point, all you do is you put in the username and password for a learning record store, the data will flow from where the person is doing that activity into the database. Simple, don't do anything. On occasions, as Wesley rightly pointed out earlier, some people who do the XAPI stuff out of the box don't do it in quite the way you want it to. So sometimes we have to do some interjection in the middle there to transform that data a little bit. So for example, typical of an articulate storyline piece of content, I talked earlier about the actor verb object. The object tends to be a unique ID of some sort, which has got zeros and alphanumeric sort of characters in it and things like that. That's okay because it identifies that piece of content, but it's a real pain in the arse to work with. If you've got something that's this long as a name of an activity or something like that, then you've got to go work back and understand what that actually was. And you've got a different one of those for every slide that somebody clicks through. Now, that's not a necessarily wonderful way to do some data analysis. But I digress. If you can get that data in the XAPI format, you're onto a good start. Some places are never going to do XAPI. And a lot of these are the things that we talk about in terms of performance. XAPI is a learning technology specification. It's relevant to us because it gives us a standard way to talk about the things that we do in learning. So there's a space in the learning, in the XAPI specification to say what score somebody got on an assessment, to say what the instructor was, to say which platform they were on, and all those sorts of things that aren't relevant to other things that don't do assessment, that don't do instructor-led training or other things like that. So XAPI is a spec that's going to work for learning technology software, but it won't necessarily work for software that's not in learning tech. And many of the pieces of software that you use today, both commercially and at home, will have an API, an application programming interface, an ability to send data from itself to another system in a standard format. So what we can do is interject in the middle there and say, Salesforce, you've got an API that tells me when a sales rep escalates an opportunity from a sales qualified into a proposal, into a won opportunity through the lead pipeline. And what I want to do is I want to take your Salesforce API and at those key points, inject an XAPI statement as a result of it. So we call it the integration pipeline. It's the sort of orange box in the middle of this diagram where we do a bunch of different things to merge that data into the XAPI format. And so we, as a provider in this space, we're increasingly kind of chomping through all of the major platforms and making these integrations that you can take out of the box and use. So if you've got a Yammer or a SurveyMonkey or a Skillsoft or something like that, then you can take all of those things and put that data into this format. Others, newer providers, will already do that. So I mentioned Filtered already. They already do the XAPI through this routine. So if you're looking at a tool like that, then you don't need to go through this process. They're one of the guys at the top of the funnel. At the bottom of this funnel, I've got CSV, I mean a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet. If you've got it in that format, then we can still do stuff with it. We can take an Excel spreadsheet and we can turn it into XAPI. So even if you can only get that, we can do something. So that's my first thing. You've got to get data into this one format. Our format's the XAPI. It's one I've chosen, my company's chosen. You may look at other ones, but to be honest, in learning, XAPI is really the game in town. So I connect it from many different sources. Regardless of whether the source is XAPI or not, I'm going to interpret it and transform it into XAPI. Now I need to do some analysis. So to do some statistical analysis, what you really need to do is to pose hypotheses. You need to pose questions. So my starter question, which has nothing to do with learning, comes from baseball. Should we draft more left-handed hitters? For the UK crowd, I really should have done cricket, but frankly, nobody understands cricket. Baseball's a little bit easier. The idea is at the start of every baseball season, there's a draft and you get to select new players. Should you get more people who bat left-handed or more people who bat right-handed? So this little case is based on a book called Moneyball by a book called Michael Lewis, got turned into a good film with Brad Pitt, about a team who used data to successfully predict which players they could recruit to increase performance on the baseball field. So they had no money compared to their competitors, but they used baseball to become proactive about the recruitment process and get people that they thought would get them wins, get them results. And the Oakland A's, the team in question, went further than they ever had using these data techniques. And what they were doing is taking data, much better data than this, but taking data, understanding some statistical hypotheses they could put against it, like which of these people would actually contribute more runs to our team, as opposed to using scouts, people who went off gut feel and said, yeah, that person looks like a good baseball player, but the data doesn't really tell that same story. So I've had a go at doing it myself. I go onto ESPN.com, download a bunch of baseball data, convert it from my spreadsheet into the XAPI format. So here I have Matt Adams, the batsman, hitting Kavia Sampson, the pitcher, and I've got all of these records of home runs being hit. And then I start to think about my hypothesis. Should I recruit more left-handed hitters? So I've also got some demographic data here. How many are left-handers? How many are right-handers? So in my little data set of 200 or so people, 51 of them are lefties, 182 of them are righties. And then I break down how many home runs they've hit over each innings, because all of that data is in my XAPI statement. And I see the dark orange in this is folks who are left-handed and the light orange are folks who are right-handed. As I look across this just anecdotally without actually doing any sort of regression analysis, it's difficult to spot a trend, because actually when the dark orange is high, then the light orange is high. And when they both go down, they go down. So there seems to be a relationship. They seem to go in step. Apart from the seventh innings, actually, the seventh innings is different. If you look at innings number 7 here, what you see is that's one of the least amount of home runs hit by left-handers and one of the most hit by right-handers. Something's interesting in the 7th innings. That's a bit of an outlier to my otherwise reasonably normal data set. So if I investigate that a little bit further, I can use my learning record store to say, well, who's doing this? Who's hitting home runs in the 7th? At this point, I highlight that 2 people, Justin Upton and Chris Carter, are actually doing all of the home runs in the 7th innings, and they both happen to be right-handed. So then if I dig a little bit deeper on Justin Upton and Chris Carter, I found out that actually it's all Justin Upton. Justin Upton's a monster of a baseball player when it comes to hitting home runs in the 7th innings. He hits all his home runs in the 7th innings. And so what I found here is one of my glorious failures. I have absolutely no evidence that you should recruit more left-handed hitters based on my very simple analysis here. But I can give you a conclusion that on this data, we should make sure Justin Upton bats in the 7th. This is the sort of hypotheses, these are the sorts of things that I'm looking to refute as we go through things. And it is this idea of refuting hypotheses that you're actually looking to do, because it's impossible for us to confirm that a relationship will always exist. But we can do the null of that. We can confirm that on at least one occasion, a relationship did exist. This is the idea of the black swans. Can you prove that all swans are white, or can you prove that that some might not be white? All you've got to do is find one black swan to prove that not all swans are white. Otherwise, you've got to find every swan in the world to find the opposite of that. It's easier to disprove the hypothesis than it is to try and prove it. We applied that technique to a case study with Villeroy and Boch. This is one of the ones that won the award. They had a blended learning program called Brand Ambassador that was designed to increase net promoter scores within their retail environments. They're having difficulty getting more footfall through the door. Difficult retail environments to be selling kitchen and bathroom wear on the high street, although they're more out of town or in department stores. But any retail environment that expects people to get out of their armchair is struggling right now. So what they wanted to do was to imbue their staff with a sense of brand ambassadorship, that the people in the store should really believe wholeheartedly in the Villeroy and Boch brand, and they would train them in the heritage, the history, and the quality that goes into V&B products in the hope that they could cross-sell more products to those people who did come in the store and increase the average transaction value at the till when people came to check out. So they did this with a training program. They rolled out brand ambassador training to everybody. They used one of our platforms, Curator, to put a social learning experience together, which involved videos and conversations about how people could embody the brand ambassador way and become more representative of Villeroy and Boch. We took data from this training experience in Curator, which was XAPI already, and we also took data from SAP, their ERP system that was in stores, along with mystery shopper data, undercover shoppers going in and seeing what it was people were actually doing and grading them in a quantitative way as to whether they were actually embodying the brand ambassador behaviors or not. We put that data, both sets, the learning and the performance data, into Learning Locker, did the analysis. Is there anything that we can see here? And what we saw was that for those stores that had received this training, there was a 1% average transaction increase over those stores who had not received any training at all. Their conversion rate was up 0.5%. So not bad. In a retail environment, 1% makes a difference. But remember, Villeroy and Boch had a trick up their sleeve here. They won Best Blended Learning Campaign. So this was only half the idea. This was the A sample. These were the stores who did online only. Some stores did a blended learning program. And in those stores, they did this Curator social learning. They also did face-to-face workshops, and they benefited from a drip feed of online synchronous WebEx stuff and newsletters that were sent out on a monthly basis to stores, drip fed through email to both the stores, to individual email addresses, and to be printed out and put up in the back office. So a continuous campaign went on about brand ambassadorship that was part of the blend: online, face-to-face, synchronous, asynchronous, and constant reminders over the summer. And when we put that data, because we're getting data from WebEx, from folks who turned up in the classroom as well as everything else, through our big data machine, what we saw is that those stores in the B sample were up 6% on average transaction values, conversion rates more than double the A. And when you look at this sort of compelling routine, you start to think that as far as Villeroy and Boch are concerned, not only have they been able to move the dial here in a difficult retail environment, they've been able to account for a 2.5 million euro uplift in average transaction values. They've also started to define which the tools in their training playbook they believe they can use. So if I want to be a bit more proactive about performance in the coming time, I can start to zero in on the things that really do work and start to do less or to move away from the things that don't work quite so well. Interestingly, for a company that, has invested relatively heavily in their online presence over the coming years, they've got a little bit of a signal here that online augmented with some other things, maybe some e-learning that's augmented with some other modes and methods of doing stuff, might actually be more effective. That's a really compelling business case to take back to the powers that be and ask for more money to get around the place and actually deliver some face-to-face workshops that are highly targeted and augmented with a continuous campaign of learning. So that's an interesting example. That one won bronze in the Best Blended Learning Campaign this year. And they continue, Villeroy and Boch do, to track this data over time. All of this was benchmarked back against historical data, so we know what they did last year and what they're doing this year. There's a case study online, which I'll provide a link to later. Coming towards the end of my time, so I need to get to the actual point of what you sat through for the last 50 minutes, guys. So thank you for your patience. The third step is to start predicting the future. The third step is to use these insights and understanding to start modeling what good looks like and start to intervene before something's occurred. So let me take an example we used in education where we can actually understand how a student is going through a learning experience and start to intervene before things have gone wrong for them. So this one's a case study from City and Guilds, where we have a set of technical apprentices going through projects. These are sort of 16 to 19-year-olds on the job, but also doing some soft skills training at the same time. And what we're doing here is trying to understand which of these apprentices are more likely to succeed and which are more likely to drop out, and look to intervene in the process before it happens. So lots of red, amber, green on this screen. Each one of those is benchmarking a week's performance against the rest of the cohort. How is somebody doing compared to their peers? And down at the bottom here, we have this momentum quadrant. Apologies if the screen's a little washed out for you. Adjust your eyes for the contrast. This is a simple 2x2 matrix that behind the scenes, we're aggregating data from both engagement, whether people are logging on a regular occasion, whether they're taking part in conversations, whether they're interacting with a coach or not, and their progression, whether they're actually turning up on the job, whether they're actually making progress through assessments and through online materials, and using it to track into this 2x2 matrix of where folks are. So this is kind of visual, but also talks about some of the algorithm that's going on behind the scenes. So folks can find themselves in broadly one of 9 positions on this grid. Down in the bottom corner, you're struggling. In the mid area, you could be doing something better. And in the top area, we believe you're on track to succeed. And as a result of this data coming in on a day-by-day basis, what we're able to do is to trigger automated interventions that start to make things different. So for those folks who are down in that bottom corner, we need to take some urgent personal action potentially here. There's no point me sending someone an email who's not engaging with online learning, because they don't engage with online learning. Why would they engage with my email? I have to find a different channel to them. So in this case, we had a tutor, but you might think about line managers or coaches or other people that can actually make a difference. Quite often, in a lot of the literature that's come out of education technology, you'll find that where you start to do some of this predictive modeling and you reach out to people in an automated fashion to tell them they're failing, they actually fail faster at that point because they know they were failing. They know things aren't going well. They feel it themselves. So you just getting the computer to reach out and says, bot says you're crap, is not a particularly pastorally good way of coaching someone through better performance. But it is a wonderful tool to give to a busy line manager, to give to someone who has no opportunity to really understand how people are doing in a role, but to give them nudges to say, this person is falling a little short in these areas. We suggest these actions. And then you get into a virtuous cycle of having suggested those actions, understanding whether or not they've made a difference to performance. Those that have, we continue to recommend. Those that don't, we stop recommending as next courses of action. It becomes a more learning machine as we recommend interventions and understand whether they lift people up the scale or not. In those top corners, we can start thinking about asking people to go further, or maybe even getting them to engage with some of the non-engaging people. So can we cross ties between the people who really engage but don't progress with the people who do progress but don't really engage, and get them into a mentor-mentee relationship to bring both of them up? Your interventions will be different, and it depends on your context of performance or formal education, as this was. But these are the sorts of models that are relatively simplistic to put together if you've got the data and the understanding of what it's likely to happen if someone's falling behind or someone's ahead of the curve. GISP, UK R&D body for higher and further education, are using this at a massive scale for what they call the National Student Data Warehouse, or Student Data Hub, actually, they're calling it. Non-continuation in the UK alone is costing in excess of 800 million a year, lost tuition fees when students drop out of a course that they've signed up to. Now, not all of that money can be saved because some folks shouldn't be there. Other things happen in your life that means that it's not suitable for you to continue studying. We're not going to save 800 million, but JISC estimates that at least 100 million of this is easily savable if universities and colleges were able to make appropriate interventions at an early enough stage to stop people dropping out. So we've worked with them to take data from lots of different systems, some of which are XAPI, some are not. Library attendance data, data from people swiping in on the wall when they register for a class, Moodle or Blackboard or Canvas as a virtual learning environment, student information systems that talk about where the students come from, what they're likely to do next, and things like that. All of that data is being sucked into that single source, the Learning Record Store, and then being fed out to other people. So the Learning Record Store, my bit, the Learning Locker, is just the warehouse. What we're then able to do is to go to lots of different people who have predictive analytics tools in the marketplace and say, hey, what can you do with this data? So you can turn up at Tribal or Civitas or Unicon, those are all providers in that space, and say, I've got data in a standard format, can we apply your tool to it? That gets really interesting when you start to think about tools like IBM's Watson and other things like that, where you're getting these big AI engines become commercial plays. Could we apply those engines much more readily if we'd already sorted the data in the first place? Because it's going to be expensive to get IBM in to sort out my data mess. But if I've got it in a single format and I've got these sorts of tools emerging that sound cool and we would really like to take advantage of, chances are you're going to be in a much better position to go to the marketplace and ask other vendors to do these sorts of tools, these sorts of modeling things for you, to make Amazon recommends real, because you've got the data in a format they can understand in the first place. That's how you can become proactive about performance. This is the sort of dashboard that an individual looking at the tribal student app, for example, would get, understanding a prediction history week by week of whether somebody is more or less likely to fail based on various factors that this vendor has decided. You as an organization may have different factors, so it's important you can open it out to different vendors and different models of what predictive really looks like. So I'm going to take a pause there and look back for questions, because I'm up against time. I did say I'd come on to GDPR, and I've got 3 whole minutes to talk about that briefly. But are there any Q&A bits that come in? I haven't got any questions there, but I don't know if anything has come through the chat, Joan.
Ben, just to say, you're so knowledgeable, it's just amazing. If anybody does have a question they'd like to ask, we can allow them to speak if they've got a microphone. They just need to put their hand up and let us know, i.e. put their hand up on Zoom. Do you do a blog? I should probably know this, or are you tweeting regularly? Because you have so much knowledge that just, you know, at your fingertips. How can we tap into that on a more regular basis? Is that possible?
So yes and no. I do write on the HT2 Labs blog, which I put a link to. So ht2labs.com/blog is where you'll find that there, and I pop up from time to time on Learning Technologies magazines and things like that. My Twitter is there. I'm less of a tweeter these days than I used to be. To be honest, my time is suckered up with trying to take these theories and nice ideas that I'm so good at expounding upon and make them happen. So I really should find more time to do that. But folks can absolutely reach out to me on Twitter or on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's increasingly a platform that I use to do that. I'm always happy to answer questions, and eventually someone will get me to write them down. Right.
I'm just going to launch the survey evaluation poll while we're speaking. But has anybody got a question they'd like to ask Ben? Can you put, have you got your Twitter handle on your final slides or slide? Because we're not seeing that.
Yeah, almost probably. Let me see. I was going to talk about GDPR. So there's a very brief slide there to show what a GDPR app looks like that's picking up data from a learning record store. So, you know, an individual's view on the data they've got is very easy to have with a learning record store. So this is something that we make and sell alongside our open source product. So, you know, there's lots of opportunities there. At @bbets is my Twitter handle. So do feel free to follow or poke me there, or look at Ben Betts on LinkedIn, or do feel free to use that most old-fashioned of things, email, ben@ht2labs.com. Visit the HT2 Labs website to check out Learning Locker, to understand the difference between our open source and our enterprise versions, and some of the apps like the GDPR privacy app that we bolt on to the Learning Record Store to make it go further. But yeah, any questions, I'm very pleased to take them.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. And just before we go then, I'd just like to mention a couple of things from the eLN's point of view. Firstly, obviously, big thank you to you for an excellent session. But we've got an event in Brighton. You're not in Brighton, are you? Are you in Oxford?
Yes, I'm sorry. I buck the UK's e-learning trend and dare not to be in Brighton. I'm in Oxford. Well,
on the 31st of May, which is next week, we've got a whole day workshop for paid up members with Tony Frashina, who's the head of the chair of the panel of judges for the Learning Technologies Awards, and Dr. Rebecca Gordon. And they're going to be looking at cognitive psychology in learning. Now, if you're not a member already, a couple of people are not members, you just need to pay the annual membership fee of £29 to be able to attend that for free. And we have sponsorship for that, so you'll get lunch, etc. We've got more webinars scheduled, and I will be putting information up on those on the website, which is about to be relaunched actually with a new look and feel. Toby's got managing that for us. And also the LinkedIn eLN page on the group page rather, which we use also for updating people. So I think if there aren't any more questions, oh, thank you, Wes. Yes, Thursday's event is sponsored by Evolve Authoring with drinks at the end. Excellent. There's an invitation you can't miss. And John has put in a comment as well, Ben. I hope you can see that. So that's really useful. Oh,
seems valid as an XAPI statement, John. I'll take that.
Well, I think without further ado, I will end the recording and say once more, thanks very much. And I hope everybody enjoyed it. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you for your time, everybody. Thanks, Joan.